Ladies and gentlemen, Binnall of America!
And now, ladies and gentlemen, your host, Tim Binnall.
No commercials, no subscriptions, no network, no rules. And at the end of the day, my friends, no comparison. Welcome to another edition of BOA The Revival. Really looking forward to this week's program. I've been looking forward to it since the weekend since probably like mid-January when our guest, Timothy Renner, first posted about this book on Facebook and let everyone know it was coming out soon. And I think I messaged him like that day and I was like, when can I have this? It was like, put this in my veins. And so as soon as the book became available, I immediately got it and set up this conversation with Timothy and devoured the book over the weekend. And it's a masterpiece. It is. It is fucking amazing, dude. It is one of the... I've read a million books in this field. It is one of the best books I've read in such a long time.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much.
We'll get into why it is so amazing and awesome, but it was like... It reminded me a lot, in some ways, to a previous guest, Justin McHenry's Lemuria book, in a sense where I learned so much reading this book. I came out of the weekend knowing so much more than I possibly did at the start of picking up this book. And it is really just mind-blowing. It really is. The book is I Have Never Minded the Loneliness, Hermits and Their Stories. And it's right there in the title, folks. It's Hermits and Their Stories. And it's just such a wonderfully colorful and sort of like obscured and mystery topic. I couldn't wait to get my hands on the book, and I absolutely loved it. And as I said, since finishing the book on Sunday, it's Thursday. I've been looking forward to this for like the last 4 days. I'm like, wow. I can't wait to get Timothy on the show to really get into this book. And one last sort of thing, I'm telling you, folks, go out and get the book. I can speak from experience. I noticed this as I was reading the book, because usually when I do these shows with All America with the guests, when it's a really good book, like the notes trail off. So like at the beginning, there's like on my notes, there's like maybe there's a note from the intro, note from like page 20, a note from page 30. Then all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's a note on page 130. Because somewhere along the way, I'm like, oh shit, I stopped taking notes because I'm just so into this book that I'm just loving this book. I'm not even stopping to make note of anything because I'm so engrossed in this book. So again, you're going to hear it a lot, folks. I Have Never Minded the Loneliness. It's on Amazon. I think you can get it on Tim's site. Just to give a little more background on Timothy Renner, he is the creator and host of the wildly popular Strange Familiars podcast. He's an artist, a musician. He's the author of multiple books, including Where the Footprints End with our buddy Joshua Cutchin. And that's an inordinately long introduction, Timothy. I apologize, but I had to really heap praise you on this book, man. It was really awesome.
Thank you. I'll take it. I spent a long time working on this. I'll take some praise. Thank you so much, though. Seriously, that is an amazing compliment. Thank you.
It's like I said, I warned you before the show started. I'm like, look, I'm going to really go nuts here because and every word's the truth. I really did love this book. Now that your appearance here on the program is long overdue. We hung out at Strange Realities Conference in 2019, so pre-pandemic. BOA was kind of sputtering along there, so it was like, oh, I don't even know when the hell I'm going to have a show again. But here we are. The revival's up and running, and not unlike our buddy Nathan Isaac back in January, it's like I got to get some of these folks every time. I've been long saying, I got to get you on All America. So as luck would have it, here is I've Never Minded the Loneliness. So since your first time on the show, I'm also almost hesitant to do this because you have such a rich background of doing so many things and everything. What is the bio, the background on Timothy Renner? How did you get mixed up in all this? And then we can kind of get into how the book came about.
Sure. Yeah. Well, in the paranormal in general, I'm just a monster kid. I was like a monster head as a child. I grew up in what I call the golden age of Bigfoot. You know, the Patty film had come out a few years before I was born in 1970. Then we got Legend of Boggy Creek and In Search of and all that pop culture Bigfoot stuff that happened in the 70s was just fired my imagination up. And really, really got into it, loved it, and then became a teenager and got into punk rock and girls and music and forgot about Bigfoot. Who cares about Bigfoot?
Happened to me too. Yeah.
there's girls in rock and roll. And like with Bigfoot who? And then I got married eventually and had kids. And one day I just sat down on the internet and remembered my love for Bigfoot. And I typed in, Bigfoot. Wonder what's happening in that world. Well, that world kept going. It didn't stop just because I wasn't paying attention. And I found a whole new, world to get interested in again and began digging into that. And eventually I got more partly into the other aspects of the paranormal and so forth and wrote a few articles for some magazines. I wrote an article for Weird USA and Weird Pennsylvania, and they used my photographs for a story on it's a local legend about Toad Road here. And I begged them. I said, please don't just print anything with these photos. Let me look over what you're going to print because there's a lot of BS out there.
Yeah.
Well, they printed my photographs with the complete nonsense BS story, like copy and paste it off the internet.
Oh, God.
And it drove me nuts that my photos were next to that. And I was like, I got to correct that. So I started what originally was going to be like a magazine article. It's like pointing out like, no, this is the real story. And then it turned into my first book. And shortly after that, started the podcast and no looking back since then.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I was thinking tonight, too, is because I was like, do we do the bio in the background? Because in a lot of ways, when I have a first-time guest on, we do like the greatest hits and sort of like Strange Familiars has 500 episodes. We could someday, and we will someday, do a show where we get into all that. We never even really did Where the Footprints End with you and Kutch. We got to get you guys on to talk about that. I don't care if the book came out a few years ago. It's like I never really explored this with you guys. But tonight we're getting into I Have Never Minded Loneliness because I'm so fucking psyched. You have no idea. Now, talk about let's start. Let's get in. I feel like I'm about to fucking sit down at a 5-course meal. Let's begin with the inspiration for the book. And I'm going to sort of set you up here a little bit so you don't have to kind of necessarily wind up to it. But in the book, a key part of the book is these hermit photographs. This is like the first mind-blowing revelation of the fucking book. And it's like right at the very beginning. And it's like, oh, apparently there was this genre of artistry, let's say, around when photography came along of hermit photographs, which is crazy. So you received a hermit photograph from your wife, and this led to one thing through another. So fire away with this awesome story. But I was blown away by this weird fucking phenomenon or genre, whatever you want to call it.
So my wife, first of all, she's an antique photography collector. She's the photography curator at a local museum. So she knows antique photography. And we've been collecting just images that we thought were cool. I mean, since before we were married, I think. We just go to antique stores and, oh, that looks neat. And we just buy these old photographs. But I was writing these books on historical Bigfoot sightings, going back and grabbing articles out of newspapers, what they called them wild men. They didn't, call them Bigfoot back then. And one day she brings this photograph in and just like literally lays it in front of me. She's like, here, he looks like a wild man. I thought you'd like him. And it was a photograph of this hermit, William Woodruff from Colebrook River, Connecticut, chapter 1. Mm-hmm. And I looked at it and I was, oh, that's really neat. And then it just got lost on my desk. If the camera could show you my desk, you'd see it now. There's just piles of paper and things I need to research and things I need to do for the podcast or whatever. And it got buried and months went by. I remember it was like all summer long. And then I think it was like August or September, it kind of shuffles to the surface. And I happened to have a few minutes that day. And I was like, oh, I wonder, I'm going to type in his name. It had, it said Billy Woodruff, I think, on it, of Colebrook River, Connecticut. I typed it in. Bam, the story comes up. this newspaper story comes up. I'm like, what the heck? And he had this amazing story. You know, he took a vow of silence, and we can get into that if you want. But that's what, and it just fired me up. And I thought, well, I wonder if the podcast listeners would be open to this, you know, because to me, it was completely fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
And we had done some historical shows, but we were doing like true crime stuff, like missing people from the past, and some circus stuff about like circus sideshow people and stuff. And I thought, I don't know, this is a stretch, but maybe they'll like it. And I did, and people loved it. And then we just started doing other Hermit episodes. And, you know, meanwhile, I started collecting other photographs, and I amassed this massive collection of Hermit photographs of, you know, starting in the, you know, late 1800s and going up to 1920, 1930, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really weird. It's like, because I think going into this, there's sort of a modern idea of a hermit, and it's very different from what the actual hermits were like in some ways, a lot of ways. Because I guess in my mind, I always think kind of like fucking Ted Kaczynski. You know what I mean? Like the most notorious modern hermit, and you think of like a hermit as sort of like at least I did, right? Like sort of like abrasive, cut off from society, and just sort of like secretive, and you can't even find them kind of thing. And it's like, no. That isn't really even at all what these hermits were like. They were of all shapes and sizes, all stripes. And we're going to get into this sort of like upending some of these ideas about hermits. But I guess and it's important, I suppose, to sort of set the time frame in a way. Most of these stories, I believe, you can correct me, it was like sort of like the early to mid 1800s to sort of the early 1900s. So we're talking about.
Yeah, about mid. So what I did, there are so many hermits. And if you just generically want to write a book on hermits, good luck narrowing it down. And when I started, that was my problem. Like, who am I going to write about, and how am I going to narrow it down? And eventually I just decided I'm going to go with my photo collection. I'm going to write about the people I have photos of. That's the way I'm going to narrow it down. So, you know, photography, you know, I think, my wife would know the exact date when the daguerreotype started. And then, but, you know, it really starts rolling about 1860. You know, there was photography before that, but it really starts rolling 1850s, 1860s. So the earliest photos in the book are probably 1860, 1870, and then on up to, you know, the 1900s.
Yeah, so it's an interesting sort of glimpse also into a whole nother world that was like 150 years ago or so. Oh, yeah. It's like, wow, this is really, so it's not so far away that it's hard to fathom, but it's far enough away that it's like, it's not at all what we live in now.
No, and I don't think so much of this, it was a different place back then. People weren't as litigious, and these guys could just go off, and maybe they were on somebody's property and people didn't care. Well, they're not bothering me. He can live there. You know, nowadays you ain't living on anybody's property. They're too afraid you're going to sue them. You know what I mean? You're not living on public lands. That's not going to happen. You know, whereas they kind of had more of a live and let live thing back then, which allowed these guys to do this. You know, I think that's why there were so many more back then.
That's a great point. Yeah. Yeah. Because I noticed that in the book throughout. It was like, he just sets up camp at some place and no one says anything really. They're just kind of like, oh, all right. You know, he lives down there by the river. And it's like, oh, okay. He just fucking lives by the river, and no one ever stops to be like, hey, you can't live here. Right.
Some of them actually owned land.
Yeah.
But a lot of these guys just found a place, like the Hermit of Irving Castle there, that cave in Athol, Massachusetts. He just wandered to that cave, and he was worried. He said he was worried that the owner was going to kick him out. And the owner found him and, well, you're not doing any harm to me. Go ahead and live in the cave if you want, you know?
Right. It's crazy. Yeah. Now, it's hard to sort of like pin it down, but if you were to give a blanket sort of definition of a hermit, because to me it was like, surprisingly, it was harder it's like the UFO phenomenon. It's like as I got into it more, it became much more colorful and diverse. So it was like, I don't even know how you would necessarily define a hermit per se, besides this sort of basic tenets. So what do you have sort of a general thing you can kind of give us? What is your basic fucking hermit?
Oh my gosh. I think it's simply someone who wants to live alone. And that's a very, very broad definition. But, some of these people weren't antisocial. Some of them were very social, but they wanted to be alone. They wanted to live alone, So they had visitors. They were very kind. They, some of them made a living selling photos of themselves, and their biographies and so forth. So they needed people in that sense, to sell the things to, but they wanted to live alone. Now the reasons for that are varied and numerous, why they wanted to live alone. And, we can get into that as well. A lot of it is, I'm guessing for some of them, they didn't really say, but I think some of these guys probably PTSD after Civil War. They're just, I'm out. Peace out. I'm done with society. And some of them certainly had mental issues, and others just, for whatever reason, they just wanted to live alone.
Yeah. It's a beautiful sort of simple but perfect definition of it, because once you set that as the base, then they kind of flourish into all these different personalities and shit. Where it's like you're saying, some are super friendly, some are super not friendly, and it's like some actually have money. It's like, wait a minute, you think they're poor or whatever, but it's like, no, it turns out this guy actually had a shitload of money or a giant piece of property. He just wanted to live on a shanty in the corner of it. Yeah.
And that could be a problem for a lot of these guys, because these rumors would go out that these hermits had money buried in their house or buried around their house or stuff. And it became a problem for some, because some really were dirt poor. And these rumors, became problems for them. They'd get visited at night by people looking for their money and stuff. And, it ended up being issues. But yeah, some of them were quite wealthy.
And I have that in the notes. There were instances, a couple in the book, where the hermits get attacked, and you feel terrible for them, because it's like, oh, dude, leave the fucking hermit alone. And one instance in the book, I forget where it was, but the guy, someone came and he's like, yeah, now this is my hovel. Get the fuck out.
Oh yeah, that was the hermit of Irving Castle. That it was a Confederate veteran came up north after the war and literally kicked him out of he spent all those years, he built a front part onto the cave and, made everything the way he wanted it. And this guy comes and kicks him out. Sound like a real jerk too. They said he would, and again, this might be PTSD, but they said this guy would just kick open his windows at night and just fire guns into the darkness. Just like,
Jesus,
what? Not a super nice guy.
Yeah. It's and so you kind of touched on why these folks become hermits, but one recurring theme that you point out in the book is sort of like this trope that gets attached to them of the lost love. It's I think that's stuck to the hermit stereotype in a way, all the way up to now. When you hear a hermit, somehow there's a couple modern day hermit stories that have popped up in recent years. And it's just like, oh, his wife probably died and he ran off into the woods because his girlfriend probably left him. It's like a weird archetype that people don't even realize has been foisted upon the hermit character, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, it came again and again. And as I was doing my final read through of the book before publishing it, I realized how many times I had to address that trope throughout and how many times I did. I was by the, 3/4 of the way through the book, I'm like, I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but it was true. They would, every article in the newspaper was like, well, he had his heart broken and he went off to live alone. Sometimes true, but not always,
Yeah, and what was interesting, it informs the book tremendously. Obviously, you dug up these life stories of these hermits, which is crazy in a way, because I always thought they were, I suppose in a way, we can get into Leatherman in a moment, but I guess a lot of my thinking is also informed by Leatherman, because I'm a New Englander, and it's I've seen the Leatherman story a million times. And it was always mysterious, no one really knew it, no one knows his name, all that. He's a super most mysterious hermit, I suppose, of them all. It's certainly in the book. Oh, yeah. But what struck me, I guess, is he's the exception to the rule, because all the other hermits in the book have you pretty much kind of uncovered their stories. It's remarkable in a way, because I was just surprised that such information was so readily available. I guess the media back then was covering the hermits.
Yeah, newspapers were big. Didn't have TV. Every town had a newspaper, pretty much. Small towns had newspapers, big towns had newspapers, and they were all looking for human interest stories, I think. So at some point, somebody who works for the paper goes, "Oh, there's that old guy who lives up on the hill there alone. Maybe let's do a story about him." And sometimes they're accurate and sometimes they're not. And that was the hardest part. Parsing the legend and the newspaper stories that were made up versus, best as I could tell, the truth about these guys and women. Excuse me if I say guys, but it's primarily men, but there's a few women in the book as well.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
So that's the research for this book. And this book took me 3 years to write and illustrate. It's different than doing research for Where the Footprints End, say. That's a matter of okay, we have these theories about Bigfoot and we want to find reports that sort of support our theories. We go looking for the reports and we find them. That's fun. This is a different kind of research. I'm not saying it's not fun. It's just way more intense because you find the story. You find everything you can about the guy's life. Everything was printed in the newspaper. You go to local historical societies, whatever you can find. And then after that, you have to decide at some point, did I find it all? Because there's always seems to be one more article, one more thing. And that becomes a really hard part, knowing when you're done researching each hermit. So it was rough. Luckily, my wife is a research demon. She helped me a lot. She's great with genealogy. She'll get on Ancestry.com and make family trees for these folks. And she'll find, if they're immigrants, she'll find the ship records sometimes when they came in. She'll find when they were naturalized. She'll find them in the census records. So she was great with all that. So that helped me at least place them where they were and say, okay, this guy, was a real person. There's one in the book that I don't think was real. It's just such a great story about the snake charmer that I just threw it in there.
Yeah.
But the rest of them, these were real people. And she was able to find most of them in the census records. Some of them, like I said, some of them she could do family trees for. And so you combine all that information, you see, does it match up? When the newspaper says he went to the almshouse, can we find him in the almshouse records, et cetera, et cetera? So, yeah. It's a different kind of research. It's way more intense. I like it, but it's a lot of work. It's hard work doing that.
Oh yeah, dude, for sure. You came up with biographies for I don't know how many are in here. At least 20, let's say. Yeah, 30. There you go. Yeah. For biographies for these people that lived 150 years ago in the most strangest of circumstances. So it's kudos to you. For even, I would look at a picture like that and be like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what that guy's story is. And here it is. You have that guy's story and gals. That's in the notes too, actually. There's at least 2 women, if I recall, that were lady hermits, which is a really unique, it stood out in the book because it was like, oh, wow. I was thinking that as I was going along. I'm like, I wonder if there's any women that were hermits. And then here we go. Yeah. A couple of female hermits. Was there anything particularly different about them that made them become hermits, or is it just sort of percentages kind of thing?
I think it's just a circumstance of life. The one was a hermit in England, Alice Grace, and she actually lived in a bacon box. She said it was her greatest possession was this bacon box because it kept the weather off of her, and it looked like a crate. Like there's pictures in the book. She's just sitting in a crate, and she lived a hard life. She came from a poor family, and she didn't want to go to the workhouse in England. So she just lived on the street, did her best to survive. And that was her character, I think, just to survive, Yeah. She found a way to make it. The other woman, the Hermit Queen of Happy Hollow, Jenny Johannica, she just, again, it was hard life circumstances. She lost her first and second husband, ended up moving to Indiana, lost her daughter. And I think that was it for her. I think she just said, I'm out, and went to live alone in the woods.
Yeah, it seems, all of the people in the book, like, it seems like something causes them to be like, I'm done with this. Yeah. I was intrigued by the bacon box. So this was like, I had that in the notes too. Like, what is this bacon box? I still couldn't, even though I saw the picture of it, I couldn't. So it was just like a giant, like, how big was this crate? Just enough for her to sit in?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, like if you look in the photos of her, like those boxes that she's sitting in are, they're the crates. So I guess it was a crate that bacon came in. That's the best I can tell. It looks like it's about 3 feet by 2 feet or so, and she's just sitting down in it. She should have kept the weather off of her. So
yeah.
Unless she's a very tiny person. It didn't give her height, but assuming she's, normally size, looks like it's, about 3 feet high or so. And she just sat in it and kept the weather off her.
It's crazy. Yeah. It's really, it's mind blowing. It's like, geez, how do people live like that? But she was, another interesting sort of aspect that came up in the book a few times was this sort of phenomenon, kind of like you see contemporaneously with homeless people when they get them into a shelter or have with a place to sleep. Very often they're like more comfortable still sleeping on the floor than they would in the bed. And this came up a few times with the Hermits, where people would try to improve their station either by getting them a bed or later, if they're sort of ailing, bringing them to a place. But they couldn't shake sort of that hermit, instincts.
Yeah, people would bring them mattresses, and then they'd visit them a week later, and the mattress would be leaning on the outside of their hermit hut. And I said, I didn't like it. I went back to sleeping on the sticks, or whatever his bed was made out of. Which I get a little bit. My father broke his back in the military and insisted on sleeping on a board his entire life. He insisted that was more comfortable for him than a bed. So I guess, if you get used to sleeping on something hard, maybe something soft is not comfortable. It seems punishing to me, but I guess, teach it.
You just get used to it. Now there's a sentence in the book, as I like to show off, even though folks at home can't see it. And just for laughs between you, me, and him, my bookmark for this book was the Cutchin family Christmas card that arrived around the same time as the book. I was like, oh, wow. All right. So, right here. What's that?
I have the Cutch family Christmas card sitting here too.
Oh, very nice. This is like, I try not to do this with the guests nowadays, but it's like this one I had to pull out a single sentence that was really just like, can you explain? This feels like a whole movie in one sentence, but this is John Smith, the Hermit of Irving Castle. And before he became a hermit, he was living with a washerwoman named Tibby Scuggle, which is a wonderful name.
Great name.
And the sentence that was like, I made a mark of it. Tibby Scuggle ran with a hard crowd, a group of imposters, that's in quotes, ranging from the gentleman beggar to the dandy thief, who hung around a boarding house known as the Beggar's Opera. But like, what? Yeah, you paint quite the picture there. What are imposters?
Well, that was a quote from his biography, from his autobiography that he wrote. So I just pulled it out. I'm assuming he meant just, thieves and people who would pretend to be other folks for devious means,
Ne'er-do-wells.
Yeah.
Wild, yeah. The dandy thief. I get us a picture. Each one you can kind of like imagine these different characters that are hanging around with Tiggy or Tibby. So this character, John Smith, talk about the ornamental hermit deal, because this was remarkable to me. Another thing I learned, an eye-opening thing. What is the ornamental hermit?
From about the 1600s to the 1800s in England, Scotland, and France mainly. It went to some other places, but mainly in those places. It became a fashion for royalty to have hermits living on their land. And so they would contract with people. So you can find advertisements in the old papers and stuff, like hiring a hermit. and they would sign contracts, and sometimes they were very specific. They couldn't cut their hair, they couldn't cut their nails. Sometimes they wanted like pious religious hermits, so they would, certain standards they had to live up to, and they could only read, religious literature and so forth. And they would, sign a contract for a length of time, sometimes a year, sometimes more, and they would live on the property. And there was even a publication that came out, I think in the 1700s, basically giving these royalties like suggestions for structures they could build to have their hermits live in. So wow. It was, if you could afford a hermit, I guess it's very much a fashionable thing. And the garden gnome actually evolved from the ornamental hermit, so that the garden gnome statue sort of is the poor man's ornamental hermit. It started in England, so for people to have their own, sort of garden hermits, and that became the garden gnome.
Wow.
So John Smith was employed as an ornamental hermit with several lords and ladies in Scotland, and before he came to America and became a hermit on his own, without being paid for it from somebody else. And I love that he called that cave Irving Castle. It seems almost like a humorous thing to us, but he went from being employed by these lords and ladies, and then he made his own castle, and he became his own, he was in charge then. He came to America and he was in charge. He wasn't working for anybody else. He was working for himself. And that was his I truly believe that wasn't a funny thing on his part. That was his castle. He was the Lord. Like, he came here and made his own space, and made his own way. Yeah. And he was not beholden to anybody else at that point. And, in a way, it's like old school America story. Come to America and make it on your own. He just did it in a way that other people don't. He just did it by himself as a hermit.
Yeah, it was cool as hell. Now, what did the ornamental hermits do? What was their? They just existed on the property, like hung out in the hut. What do they do?
But pretty much that's it. And you would want to, like, you'd bring visitors on, and you show them your hermit stuff. And there were several that got in trouble. This is a kind of a boring life, and if you're not cut out for that, it's hard. And they would find them at the local pub, knocking some back, and they weren't supposed to be there, and they get fired and lose their jobs and so forth. So, but mostly it was you're pretty much what it says. You're an ornamental hermit. Your job is to be there when they want to show you off to visitors, and so like, there's my hermit. I have a hermit living on my land. So I imagine it's an incredibly boring job at sometimes. Like, I can't imagine just sitting there and waiting for, Lord Underpants to bring whoever in to, check you out.
Yeah. And what do you even do? Like, how do you get shown off? That's the weirdest part. It's one thing if you have duties or something on the thing, but it's like they just come over and like look at you in your hut. Like, that's my hermit.
Yeah, like the ones that were supposed to be more religious, I can, sort of more understand that, because they're, they'd be, studying or reading the Bible or whatever religious literature, or praying and so forth. And I can understand, you have this very pious air about it. But if you're just a hermit, it's got to be an incredibly boring job sometimes.
And even more remarkable is that it's like a fucking job. That they're getting paid, like you made a note in the book when you were first introduced this character. It was like a professional hermit. It's like, who the fuck even knew there was such a thing as a professional hermit?
I mean, oddly enough, my friend who wrote the introduction to the book, the foreword, he had bought me a book on ornamental hermits years ago, before I started collecting pictures, before I'd written any of this, hadn't even a clue that I would be writing this. He bought me a book on them just randomly. Like I think for Christmas one year, he gave it to me as a Christmas present. Little did I know, a few years down the road, it would come into play here.
Yeah, it's wild. It's almost like, I don't know, I kind of want to be an ornamental hermit. I wish they would bring that back. That would, I'd go for that. Well, it's interesting in a sense that I thought it was almost like a carryover in a way from the ornamental hermit tree, let's say, to, in some instances, and I can't quote the specific one, but I'm sure you may know of a few in the book, but like these hermits, they become almost here in America ornamental local hermits, where they're like a beloved member of the community who that is their fucking ornamental hermit, essentially the town's ornamental hermit. Yeah,
the fellow that was on Long Island, he lived at Far Rockaway. They really the community really kind of took him in, and he was part of the community. And when he was unable to take care of himself, they really took care of him. They made sure he had food. They would check on him. He was Charlie the Hermit, one of two Charlie the Hermits that lived there. But there was probably some value there to the community because they said he was a genuine tourist attraction.
Right.
People would come to Long Island and they would say like, "Oh, I get to see a real hermit, while I'm here." Well,
right.
Ornamental. Back at the time, it was quite a thing. So he was a valued member of the community in that aspect. Others, like John Smith, Hermit of Irving Castle, people visited him, and they came every weekend. They said he would have lines of people every weekend, and he would sell photos of himself and sell his biography, and they would just visit him. And he was a real tourist attraction there in Irving. People would take the train out and then make their way to his place, which, having gone there, I visited that cave. I cannot see an easy way to it. I don't, maybe at the time there was an easy way to it, but I took the easy hike to it, and it was pretty rough. And I'm a pretty steady hiker. So it must've been a thing at the time to get there in the 1800s. It must've been a real trip.
Well, there wasn't much to do back then. So if you heard there was a friendly hermit, it's like, I can see myself, being like, let's just drive down. We'll go see the fucking hermit. You can talk to him and buy pictures from him and shit.
Yeah. I mean, he had a whole cottage industry. I mean, he made a good portion of his living just by selling that biography and selling photos of himself.
Yeah. Again, that's sort of like what flies in the face of my expectations about hermits, where it was like, some of these guys are super self-promoters. It's again, I'm like, oh, I thought these were people who really didn't fucking want anyone around them or anything to do with them. But in some cases, they were like showmen almost. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, there's the fellow, and I'm drawing a blank. I know his sort of hermit name. Let me find it here. His actual name, the Emperor of the Rockies, Frank Gimlet. The photo I found of him, he's standing in a tub. He's in his underwear, and his clothes are hanging on the line, and it says "Bathing Beauty, 1943, sans brassiere and girdle." He's a little bit later. He's one of the later hermits I have in there from the 40s. And when I first got it, I thought, oh, they're making fun of him. Somebody came by and snapped a picture of this hermit, and they're making fun of him. He's the butt of the joke. But no, he sold that picture. He was in on the joke. He sold that picture of himself. So that made me feel a lot better about that photo. I was kind of angry when I first found it, like, that's kind of, like maybe he didn't want to be photographed like that, but he was in on the joke. Like I said, he sold the picture himself. So, had a good sense of humor, I suppose.
Yeah. And it's interesting carrying on the idea of these sort of, I found it amusing in some ways too. It is a hard life, but in some instances where these hermits were adopted by their community, it was like they kind of figured out how to break the system. Because in at least one instance, there was like a fucking local baker that brought the guy bread every morning, and it was like, shit, dude, that's fucking like.
Yeah, that was
you don't work. You live in a little shack, and the town is like bringing you fucking food all the time and giving you shit. It's like you kind of fucking work the system here.
That was the fellow out at Far Rockaway. Yeah, that people checked on him. They bought him at some point. They built him a new little house. His house was so run down. They're like, we'll build you a new one. And like I said, I think the community was fond of him anyway. I don't think he caused much trouble, and was pretty respectful and did his best to keep to himself. But I think there was some value in him, like I said, as a tourist attraction. I think that's kind of why that happened. They're like, we'll take care of him. He's bringing people in.
Yeah, it's a pretty sweet gig. Like I said, he's getting free bread every morning, and
I know it wasn't even like the day old bread. They were bringing him fresh bread. Yeah.
Well, I also thought it was interesting too. I'd be interested in this. I don't know necessarily if it's ever come about, but it's like some of these hermits had children before they became hermits, which means there may be people out there who are related to these famous hermits. I wonder if anyone has ever like figured that out on their own, that like, oh, my great grandfather was fucking a famous hermit.
I had someone who shared one of the hermit's names in the same general area as the hermit ordered the book from me. I don't know if they're related or not. I asked my wife, I was like, I gave the person's name. I was like, see, get on Ancestry and see if this person's related. She couldn't quite figure it out. So maybe, that's, I hope I do them justice. I tried to not, what I did not want to do is sort of make cartoons of them. I wanted to tell their stories as best I can and to tell the real story. And I do tell the legends because the legends are interesting, but I try to like, as best I can, where possible, parse truth from legend and give their stories as best I can. So, I'm mindful that some of their descendants are probably out there and, maybe reading about this. I know Brusher Mills, the guy on the cover, he's got descendants in England. That at least in the 1970s they were alive because they had written a song. One of his, I think his great niece or something had written a song about him. So they're around.
Yeah, I think just to sort of capture the time frame in a sense too. I think like there's a story where the hermit comes to this guy's house. And it's later recounted by his daughter, like in an interview in like the 80s or something, and she's in her 80s. So it was like, holy shit, she's looking back to the early 1900s for when she was like 8 years old when this hermit came to their house. It was like, wow, this really was a long, long time ago when you think of it.
Oh yeah, yeah, and people's memories aren't perfect. There was a woman who wrote a history of Colebrook River, Connecticut, who's William Woodruff, the very first hermit in the book, and the first one I started collecting. And she has her stuff at the Historical Society there, but her memories, like, they just don't jive with the facts. Like, and I'm not blaming her. That's the way stuff goes. You kind of think, well, this must have happened and that must have happened. But like, for instance, she blames the photographs of him he was one of the ones that got robbed and attacked. And she blames the photographs for calling attention to him. Well, the robbery happened in the 1890s and those photographs didn't come out till like 1907, 1909. So it's absolutely impossible. Couldn't have been. I understand her making that connection, but that it just wasn't true. But she did have other valuable information, memories of meeting him, of going into his I hate to call them shacks, his cabin, and what it looked like and so forth. So you get a mix of stuff with these memories. But and she wrote that in the 1950s, and she was quite old when she wrote it. I'm sure she's not around anymore. So it's amazing what is out there on these folks.
Yeah, it really is, because they existed, like I said, like 150 something plus years ago. It's really it's really remarkable. Now, often I think that, again, because we'll tell the story of the Leatherman in a minute, but I'm biased because of the Leatherman. Did you find, and you're kind of close to New England, is this sort of, I always kind of imagine this thing sort of a very New Englandy sort of East Coast, down to Pennsylvania, maybe a little further, but were there other instances of hermits like running around Georgia, Florida, Texas as well?
So I have them
a lot in the book. So
I have them, all over the U.S., a few in England, Brittany, but most of them are in New England, and I haven't really figured that out yet because it's cold. You would think Florida would be a much easier place to be a hermit, than New England, but maybe it's something to do with that sort of New England independence. I'm just going to do it and I'll make my way. I was not super. I like these old timey hermits, but somebody sent me a story on the guy up in Maine who was a hermit in recent times.
Yeah.
And he just walked off, and he was living in a tent. He wouldn't leave his tent all winter long because he was afraid his tracks in the snow, people would find where he was. So he literally stayed in his tent. I mean, so people are still doing it, and you can do it. I mean, it's a hard life, but it can be done. But yeah, I don't know why so many New England like that. My wife kept it all throughout, right? Collecting. She's like, "Oh, where's that guy from? Connecticut? Where's that guy from? Massachusetts?" On and on. Why don't they move someplace warm? Where that's
it's very weird.
Yeah. But tons in New England.
Yeah, I wonder if it's sort of like also some kind of old world connection or something. Like hermits essentially originate more in England in a sense, I guess. But I suppose it's been hermits all through time. But but maybe sort of like that idea of hermitry. I don't even know if that's really a word, but hermitry, sort of like kind of crossing over to America in a way that like people had the very concept, I can become a hermit, sort of thing. Yeah,
I it's hard to parse out. Now there are plenty of hermits in Pennsylvania. There are plenty of hermits in the South. There just seems to be more in New England. There's like a huge concentration of them up there. And, that's the big question. Why?
Now, you mentioned I think it was two Chris's, but I may be wrong, but two characters with the same name that cross paths. Two Charlies, excuse me. And this would have been in the book, but have you ever kind of come across any instances where hermits cross paths somehow?
Yeah, well, we have a very similar instance here in York, Pennsylvania. There's a guy who went by the name of the Squire, and he was a hermit that lived in a park in York City. And at some point, another hermit moved in there, and they started calling him the Squire. I think only because, they were both black. That was part of it. But I think only because they didn't know what else to call him. Here's the two Charlies. The second one, his name was not Charlie, but the other hermit that preceded him was Charlie. And here comes this other hermit in the same location. I think, oh, that's Charlie the hermit. And I think the same thing happened here in York. Oh, it's the Squire. He's the Squire. So, there's that. I think the Blue Mountain Hermits, the two in Berks County, Pennsylvania, they were living on the same mountain at the same time. I find it almost impossible they wouldn't have been. They had the same job before they became hermits. They were both like woodcutters for
weird,
for charcoal, and I just find it very they had to be aware of each other. Now my wife says, "Oh no, they didn't." They could have lived two sides of the mountain and never even known each other. But it's not that big of a mountain. I really think they must have at least been aware of each other. And since the one of them was a firebug and the other one got his hut burnt down one time, I wonder if he didn't set the second guy's hut on fire.
Oh. Could be, yeah. And if either of them had visitors, maybe someone would have been like, "Hey, do you know the other hermit on the mountain? He's all like he doesn't live here; he lives over there, or something like that." One would assume if they ever kind of came across someone from the outside world, they might have mentioned it in passing.
Yeah, and they in the newspapers they called them both the Blue Mountain Hermit. The Blue Mountain Hermit, and you had to figure out which one they were talking about by name, in the article.
Yeah. Wild, man. Let's do the old leather man. Let's talk about this.
Right.
When I got into the book, I was like I said, I'm biased. I've seen they have a local sort of community show here in New England that runs the old leather man story at least twice a year. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really familiar with it. Sort of like I really love it. And when I cracked open the book, I didn't look in the table of contents. So I'm like, as I was going along, I'm like, I wonder if he did the old Leatherman or if that's too mainstream a hermit. And then I turned the page as I'm getting in and I'm like, oh, there he is.
Yeah, I had done so on the podcast. I had done the Leatherman for a patron show, so it wasn't on the main feed. And I get requests. at least once a month from people. So you do the old Leatherman, do that. And I have to say, oh, I did them. It was on a patron show. So when we talked about this book on my podcast recently, I did a whole section on the Leatherman to try to fill that appetite a little bit for folks. Very popular guy. I realized that if I leave him out of the book, people are going to, I'm going to get the same kind of emails I get for leaving him out of the show.
Yeah.
Plus, I like him. I mean, he's a really, really interesting guy.
Yes.
And as I said, a true mystery, which is very hard. Even you think, people got lost all the time back then. I was able to find information on almost all these people. Leatherman, he is. We got nothing. We know when he died, he had a scapular on and a French Catholic prayer book, so we know he was Catholic. He refused meat on Fridays, so those three things that'll tell us, he's Catholic. Other than that, he had a French accent. He spoke French and a little bit of English. We don't know anything else about him. True mystery.
Yeah, it's really crazy. And for folks who don't know, this guy was covered in a leather suit, and he did a counterclockwise circuitous route through I think Connecticut and Pennsylvania or something along those lines.
Connecticut and New York. I think every 34 days he completed the loop clockwork. He was so steady and constant in it that they said farmers would plant by his arrival. They would planting their crops by his arrival. He was an itinerant hermit, which is, he didn't stay in one place. He had a series of caves and lean-to shelters that he stayed in on his way. The leather suit was patchwork. It was made from the tops of leather boots and stuff he would find, and he just sewed them together. It weighed 60 pounds, and he wore it winter, summer, all year round. So it's hot in the summer. It's cold in the winter. There's no way around this being a comfortable thing. You do wonder if it was some kind of self-imposed penance or something he was doing. It was not a comfortable suit. He had boots that he made himself with wooden soles. So the tops were leather. The soles were completely inflexible, just wooden soles. So he's walking, 10 plus miles a day in these stupid boots that don't even, flex. So, stomping basically as he goes. Rough life, really rough life. But he didn't beg. He would stop at houses that had offered him food previously, but he would never stop at a new house and beg or anything. He was kind to children. They know that there's some stories of kids who would eat lunch with him and stuff. He didn't speak, but he was very kind to them. He didn't talk to them, but he would sit there and eat with them. And at some point, they started taking photos of him because he was such a curiosity. And I think the first photo they have him, and I might be wrong about this, there's a great book on him, just on the Leatherman, that reprints all the articles and all the photos of him and everything's a fantastic book. I think it's just called The Old Leatherman. And I believe the first photo of him taken he was kind of behind a clothesline, and they had some clothes hanging up and a guy with a camera, and somebody pulled the clothes and they snapped a picture of him. I think that's how they got the first photo of him. Eventually he ended up posing for a couple photos. They're very expensive when you can find them. They didn't print a lot of them, but they're, everyone wants one. Everyone who lives in the area wants one. They go for the cabinet card photos, which are, paper photography, some of the first paper photography. They'll go for $300+ if you can find them. Yeah. I don't own one. I own a postcard that was taken from one of those. So the postcard was from 1900 or something. It was taken from one of the original photos of him. But there's I think 10 images of him or something like that he was, such a curiosity. And these local photographers would sell those pictures. So when you'd walk down the street and they'd have these pictures in their window, same as circus performers and stuff, any curiosities like that, they would sell pictures of, people would buy them just to fill up their albums and, didn't have TV back then.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So you'd flip through the book of Hermits. And imagine what their lives are like and stuff.
Yeah. So, he's a real mystery. He developed cancer in his lip at some point, and some of the photos you can see it, his lips swollen up, and they said he would lay a piece of leather over his lip and drink hot coffee or soup or anything hot like that, so it wouldn't hurt him. And eventually, he died. They found him in one of his caves in Sing Sing, New York. And the saddest thing about him is in the 1880s. So he first shows up in 1858, just walking. And they don't know where he came from. If we had a name, we could maybe see when he immigrated. We don't. We have no name. He might have walked down from Canada. He might be French Canadian. He might have come from France. We don't know. But after years of him there, it's in the 1880s, a guy named W.A. Saleson published an article, and this was published in several New England newspapers. It's called Mystery Solved. And it claimed to tell the true life story of the Leatherman. And they said his name was Jules Bourgelat, and that he had been engaged to the daughter of a leather merchant who had entrusted him with the money, all this money, and he made these investments, and the investments went bad, and then the leather market failed. And his fiance's father was so mad, he just, "You're not marrying my daughter." And he goes off and loses his mind, essentially. How he loses his mind and then ends up in America, they don't really explain in the article. But essentially, he's walking around in this leather suit as penance, for what happened there in France, losing his potential father-in-law's money or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, this is entirely made up. This guy just made up this story, every bit of it false. But it became the story, and newspapers printed this as the Leatherman story, as his name, until the 1980s. So from 100 years, that became this guy's story, completely made up. Finally, somebody, even his tombstone used to say Jules Bourgelat on it. And finally, somebody corrected, and they said, "No, this is," they dug up the information, and they said, "No, this is a complete falsehood." Yeah. And they exhumed him. I want to say about 10 years ago. I might be off on that.
In modern times. For sure.
Yeah. And they were going to see can we find DNA? Can we find anything about this guy? Well, he had completely returned to the earth. There's nothing in his grave. They found 3 or 4 coffin nails, something like that. So his wooden coffin had disintegrated. He had nothing there. So they reburied the coffin nails, and they gave him a new tombstone, which just says the Leatherman on it now, because there's no sense giving him a false name. That's who he was. But yeah, he just remains this true mystery. Even his suit was it was bought by one of these dime museums in New York City. Yeah, and it was lost in a fire. Yeah. So wherever it is, they don't know where it is. They think it might have been lost in the fire. In any case, they don't know where the suit is. There's a couple historical societies in Connecticut that have some of his mittens, his leather mittens, and like his pipe and stuff. Yeah, they have some pieces of it, but the suit as a whole is gone. So there's not much left. But what an interesting fellow! A true mystery. He will always remain a mystery. We're not going to find out who he was. Yeah, incredibly enigmatic. Really, just a wonderful story. Now, do we know? I don't have 31 days or 34 days or whatever to kill some, but do we know, because I would love to do the Leatherman route. Maybe if I ever retire. They know. Do we know the route? They know exactly the route he took, and there's caves along the way. There's several caves in New York and Connecticut they actually call Leatherman Cave. That's because he stayed there. So they know exactly the route he took, and you can do it if you want. Someday when I retire, it's like 10 miles a day. I think a little bit more than 10 miles a day. Like a lazy man's Appalachian Trail. There you go. The Leatherman. I might be able to handle that one. Yeah. See, that would be cool because at some point, at least you're walking through towns and shit. So you're like, oh, here I am. I'm going to stay in this town and take a shower and clean up. If you want to be hardcore, you got to do it in a 60-pound leather suit. And, exactly. Yeah, that's true. But yeah. Well, I was thinking of that. Beyond the penance possibility, I thought maybe also just a practicality thing where it's like this leather suit is his. He needs this to survive in the winter, and it's his most vital possession, and he's constantly on the move. So his only other option is to hide it somewhere
And maybe in his mind, he's like, I cannot fucking lose that suit because that's how I survive. So I'm just going to keep it on at all times, no matter how treacherous this experience is.
I mean, it would have helped in the rain. I think leather's not super warm. That's the thing. Like, it's hot in summer, it's cold in winter, you know. But I mean, it was big enough. Like, he looks like a big guy, and he wasn't really. It's just that suit was it just hung on him in such a way that it makes him look like he's a really big guy. But he's not eating much. And he's walking 10 miles a day. He was not a big fella. You know, it's just the suit makes him look like pretty big.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. And I think he's the only hermit in the book, as you mentioned, itinerant, who didn't have a specific like shelter that was their day-to-day home.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is really,
there was a couple I think that moved back and forth but they were in the general area. They might have a cave and a hut, you know. They would move back and forth, but they generally were in one place.
Yeah, yeah. And just speaking to sort of like this is the part that really struck me when I brought this up earlier, but sort of like the press coverage of hermits. There's a guy, William Pester. He's like, he's quite a character. And he's like, I'm going to go to fucking Hawaii and be a hermit there. And and like, he explains why, you say in the book, he explains why to like the Honolulu newspaper. And it's like, what the fuck is this guy, like the Beatles? Like, he's coming to Hawaii. Like, he's doing a press conference about his move to Hawaii to resume his hermitry there. It was like, this is not what I thought hermits were at all. So I guess kind of extrapolate a little bit on that and this character. Weird.
He's a real character because he was German and he came to America to escape military service because he was part of this, I think it's called the Lebensreform movement, basically a back to nature movement, and like early hippies. And if you look at the photo of him in the book, he looks like he looks out of time. He looks like somebody from the 60s. He does not look like somebody from the picture was taken in the 1920s. And he became known as Nature Boy. And I'm trying to find here it is. He first comes to America. He is in New York for a bit. Decides he doesn't like that, and he starts heading down south. I think he goes through the south and ends up all the way in California, in Palm Springs, in the desert. And he makes himself a little hut, and he stays there, and he lives off of figs and whatever he can find around. And he's kind of clothing optional. He has a monk's robe that he wears sometimes, but he also, you know, kind of goes naked when he wants to. There's pictures of him playing a slide guitar. Again, he just looks like somebody. He looks like a hippie from the 60s. He really does. Long hair, beard. He's got a slide guitar in his lap and cut off shorts. Sometimes he's wearing the one photo I have is a press photo of him. He's wearing a headband and he just looks like he's from the 60s. So he's there in California, and there's a fellow named Eden Abez who wrote a song that Nat King Cole made very popular called Nature Boy. And it's thought that William Pester might have been the subject of that song. Now, the question is, like, Eden Abez, however you pronounce his name, he lived in the same area, but he also lived a very similar life to Pester. He was almost a hermit of his own. He might have written a song about himself or about other people he knew like that, but I think William Pester was sort of happy to let everyone think the song was about him.
Yeah, yeah.
And he ends up getting into some trouble.
Yeah.
And this is so his photos, the real photo postcards of him sell for, a good bit too, $70 or so. And I often wonder if people know this part of the story when they buy those money. He was in prison for a while. He was not a hermit for a little while, and he was sent to prison because he was, this is a quote from the prison records. They designate him a sex pervert. So, he was having sex with underage boys and sent to prison for some time. So one of the photos of him is his photo from the correctional records of San Quentin prison. that we got in the book. So he was, probably not as a super nice guy there, assuming that he wasn't falsely convicted. After that, he ends up, he did go to Hawaii. That was before he got convicted. Stays there for an undetermined amount of time. He's in Hawaii, and then all of a sudden, the newspaper articles have him back in California. So he came back at some point, went to Arizona for a while. Then he gets in trouble with the law, comes back to California, gets in trouble with the law. Eventually goes back to Arizona, and he ends up dying there alone. And he had another sort of hermit hut there. And it was in Black Canyon, 50 miles north of Phoenix, a place called Black Canyon. And he died there in 1963. He was 78 years old. Don't know how long he was there. They said his body was badly decomposed when it was found. So he lived and died alone.
Yeah. He's a character.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. He's very good at sort of getting his name out there, it seems.
Yeah, he was. He was a lot of newspaper articles about him. I had to kind of pick and choose to find his story, but there were a lot of articles about him. He was very intent on showing people they could eat on, it's like $3 a week or something, whatever it was at the time. So he did a lot of stuff with that. Like I said, back to nature kind of thing, like trying to get people to live simply and so forth.
I thought it was also interesting. You tell a story in the book about one of the hermits and these gypsies, and you make a point of pointing out that's how they're described in the media back then. We don't know. Some people take offense to that term. We don't necessarily even know if they mean Romani people or traveling people or whatever. That was just a description. So, don't send us emails. But when they broke into his house, they realized he was a hermit, and there was like this sort of this like respect between the two unique sort of personalities or archetypes or whatever. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. Then it's kind of in the dark, and they saw I think he had a ring on his fingers, and they were talking about cutting his finger off to get the ring. He wakes up to this, and then the other guy's like, just make it simple, just kill him. We'll take it anyway. And he sort of stands up and says, can I help you? And then they recognize him as the hermit. And he said they had an almost like a superstitious reaction to it. Like, oh no, that's the hermit, and they left him alone. It was like no problem from that point. But if they didn't recognize him as that, we might have been writing a different chapter on him.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it was interesting because it sort of suggested in a way, and there were other instances in the book whether they were self-styled or just perceived that way. But the hermits take on sort of an air of mysticism, like they can tell the future, or they're special in a way, like you can't, almost paranormal in a way, or sort of like shaman-like.
Yeah. There's several weather predictors. Alice Grace, the woman who lived in a bacon box, towards the end of her life, she was reading the fortunes for people. I think reading cards for people. The Albion Clow, he was a very poor predictor of the future, but he for a while he was telling fortunes and predicting the future. He predicted his own death and well outlived it. But yeah, he did it, and. There's another fellow, the hermit up there at Mosquito Pond outside of Manchester, New Hampshire. He said he had powers and he could find people missing in the woods. He actually, he was Charles Lambert, and he said he could. The quote from him is, "All I have to do is wait until it's dark, and then my power comes to me." And he said he could see in his mind the color of their blood, and if it was black, he knew they were dead, and if it was red, he knew they were still alive, which is like, part of me goes, was this dude killing people and leaving me in the woods and then pretending to find them? But he doesn't seem to be that kind of guy. He seems to be like, there's no other indications that was in his character, but it was odd that he's like, I'll find him. I found many people dead and alive in these woods.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I can see how if you lived in that time and you're like in the town and you're part of the society, and there's someone who's dropped out of society and they're on the outskirts like that, I could see how, especially back then, you'd be like, they're special. They know that, they're.
women who, who lived outside, they were always witches, right? The older women, they lived alone, maybe a little bit outside of town, often get accused of being witches. I think there is that sort of attitude, like there's something special about these folks, or they have some kind of powers. That does get assigned to people. The Johannika, the Hermit of Happy Hollow, the woman, the second woman in the book, they thought she was a witch. The children, they said, thought she was a witch. They gave no reason for it besides she lived alone. She lived alone. She was an unusual person. If you hear something in the background, I know you'll appreciate this. It's my rabbit digging. So.
Oh, nice. Nice. Excellent. Yeah. I got mine. He's not in the room, but he's like right over there.
There's no stopping the digging when they want to dig. You just got to let them go.
Sure. It's really I was taken aback sort of by the mysticism sort of aspect of it, because it does kind of, you do think that. Now, this is kind of like a ridiculous question in a way, but like, is it possible? I suppose anything's possible. Is it possible to have like a 2-person hermit situation, or is that a different? Would you classify that as a different kind of thing? Where like just 2 people, maybe a man and a woman, maybe a man and a man, maybe a woman and a woman, who knows? But a couple are like, let's drop out of society. Let's essentially become hermits, but just two of us.
I think that by definition.
Yeah, that's the weird part, right?
Maybe not, but I'm certain it's happened. And then you have these loose things, like a lot of. So I didn't do a lot of religious hermits, and that I would like to. That might be another book someday. But a lot of these religious hermits, they actually live in communities,
right?
But they're individual cells, or they have a place that's sort of away from the others. They do come together, at times for prayer or meal or whatever, but they're still considered hermits. So maybe something like that applies. A lot of this too is self-definition. I think some people just define themselves as hermits, or the newspapers. Oh, this guy's a hermit. And, kind of go with that. Some of them might be better defined as recluses, than hermits, but, to make That's the interesting part. And it's interesting too, how the archetype of, like, I think you mentioned at one point somewhere, where the specific hermit you mentioned in the book, like, lived. Now it's like, it's been 150 years or whatever. And it's like a park or something, like a mini, there's a mini golf or something called like Hermits, Hermit's Cave or whatever. It's just like interesting how the idea of a hermit has sort of like evolved into this caricature, pop culture-y kind of stereotype. Yeah, that's Charles Coffin. He was he lived at what was called the Maine Desert, which isn't a desert. It's 40 acres of glacial sand, basically poor farming, left this place in Maine that looks like a desert, but there's trees around the sandy area. There's trees all around. It's not a desert, but it looks like that. They call it the Desert of Maine. And in 1925, a guy decided to, make this a roadside attraction. Why not? Right. So he bought it, and this hermit happened to live right near there. And his name was Charles Coffin. He invented, and I wish this was still around. Maybe it is someplace. I'd love to hear it. A piano organ. He combined 2 pump organs and a piano to make one instrument that played at the same time, a piano and organ. It was supposed to sound really, really cool. And he toured. So, he wasn't such a hermit that he, was so afraid of people. He tour around with this and do musical tours and so forth. And at some point he was so popular, and he had a place there, like I said, right outside the Maine Desert, where he had a little shop. He was selling stuff, and he was doing well enough to hire somebody to work for him for a while.
It's like completely blows the whole idea of a hermit out of my mind. Yeah.
But called himself a hermit, and I guess besides this person that worked for him, lived alone. And right now there's a miniature golf course there called the Hermit's Adventure. Yeah. And they have a statue of Charles Coffin, a very cartoony kind of statue. Looks like something you'd have to admit, but it's him. So he got his red beard, and so that's like the nod to the hermit that was once there. I think probably most people who go golfing there have no clue.
That it's based on a real hermit. Yeah. that lived like down the way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things you mentioned too here, another interesting aspect of this, I suppose when you live alone, this would come up. Many of the hermits were quite musical.
Yeah.
It was very interesting. It's just kind of like, well, that makes sense in a way. It's sort of like, I think also to carry on, and maybe you can kind of speak to this, musical, and in a lot of ways, many of these hermits were quite intelligent. I think there's a misconception that people might have that like these guys are, off their rocker, so to speak. But it's like, no, some of them just were eccentric in a way. However, you like you said, reclusive. But some of them were highly educated, deep into knowledge of stuff, wildly talented, musical. One of the guys was an actor, the ornamental hermit. He was an actor. So I guess, can you speak to that a little bit? Just like sort of how the idea that these guys were just destitute, couldn't, that kind of idea. It's like, no. Some of these were learned men.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And a lot of the newspapers, excuse me, make note of what books they had in their collection. Like, oh, he had Darwin and he had Spencer and he had, all these different, philosophy books and religious books and science books in his collection. A lot of times we'll make a note like how well-spoken he was. Like, this guy is in a super well-spoken. He's, can carry on a conversation with the best of them. So look, there may be something to the type of person who is super intelligent and or creative, sometimes both, that maybe aids them in doing this. And I'm basing this on my best friend who wrote the foreword to the book. He went off to a cabin by himself in Massachusetts. There we go, New England again. So he's working on his doctorate from Harvard. This is a very intelligent man.
Yeah.
Incredibly talented musician. And one day he's just like, no, I'm out. And I had to write letters to him. There's no internet, no phone. I had to write letters to him. He came up with his own calendar based on the moon. And the only way to see him was visit him. So I would, drive up to Massachusetts to visit him. And I had to do it by his calendar. And to be honest, I never quite understood his calendar. I never really got a hold of it. He tried to explain it to me. So I would kind of like, well, I think I'll be here like between this time and that time. Inevitably, I would show up and knock on his door. He'd be like, whoa, oh, I didn't know you were coming today, because I never get, but he's brilliant, absolutely brilliant guy. It's, people often say, like somebody was the smartest guy in the room. I've been with the smartest guy in the room. It's that guy. And he wasn't cocky about it. He didn't. This guy worked in a convenience store, while he's getting his doctorate from Harvard. You know what I mean? So very down to earth person, but super intelligent and super creative, fantastic musician. And you just wonder if there's something about that kind of mind that allows them to just like, no, I need to go inward for a while. I need to step away. And as he says in the foreword, he says, and he told me many times, like, those were some of the happiest times of my life, just being alone at that cabin.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. Now, I don't know if this applied to your friend, but this is sort of on a lighter note. One thing I kind of, thanks to the book, I took home as a prerequisite for anyone's listening. It's like, okay, I'm ready to do this hermit thing. I feel like one of the prerequisites for the most part is you have to just let your beard fucking go nuts. Like you have to just completely give up on taking care of that beard. It has to be, it's just fucking wild, shaggy, long. However, like once you're like, I'm a hermit, that's the end of fucking tending to the beard.
Yeah. You hermits and wizards, you gotta have a certain growth of beard. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly a thing for the majority of them. There's a few that are clean shaven, but they are definitely in the minority.
Yeah, it really comes home in the pictures. There's one guy that had a beard like down to his feet. It was like, holy shit.
Yeah, he was the they called him the giant hermit of the Adirondacks. He's another Smith. He was Bill Smith. Yeah, he was close to, he was like 6'8" or something like that. Very tall, but at the time, super tall, right? You know, average height of a man in the 1800s was like what, 5'7" or something like that. So if he's like a foot taller, you know, very, very tall, but more than that, he had an 8-foot long beard. He could stand on his beard when he was standing up. And they said he could take his mustache and just have his arms out at length and hold either end of his mustache. Yeah. That's like super hirsute guy. Yeah. And he would actually do stints at dime museums in New York. So he would come down out of the Adirondacks and go to New York City and, you know, be on exhibit. You know, that's the photo I have of him was taken when he was down there as basically, you know, a human exhibit, like a kind of like a sideshow guy. They had these dime museums. Yeah. And he'd go for a little stint there and sell pictures of himself. And I guess, you know, get paid a certain amount, just have people gawk at him.
Yeah, it's really strange in a sense too. Yeah, the Hermit was like it feels more like it was like an everyday thing to the people of the day back then. Like it wasn't like if I heard there was a fucking hermit in my town living in the fucking woods, I'd be like, that's crazy. But in this was like a natural part of the society back then. It was like, yeah, like we were talking about earlier. Yeah, that's our hermit. He lives down by the river. That's the town's hermit. It's like
seems like so almost think about. Every town had a hermit, if not more than one. It's just like, and again, that's why I had to narrow it down some way. And I just said, well, if I choose the photos, then people get to see, you know, photos of these folks when they read. And, you know, I thought that would, you know, increase the interest a little bit, because otherwise there's so many. I mean, there's some here in York, quite a few that I've gone to see, you know, where they lived and so forth, but I didn't end up finding photos of them. Well, one of them is pre-photography. One of them was he built these stone walls and stuff through the woods. You can still find some of them, and at the place where he was, but he was dead by I think 1840 or something. So there's no photos of him. Yeah, but there's some others that were around. I just didn't collect any photos of. But yeah, and that became a real fun thing for me to do, is to find where I could to visit these folks. With the Gettysburg Hermit, when I found out there was a guy in Gettysburg, and they said he had a place his cabin was on the most remote part of the battlefield. It's called Wolf Hill. So they call it the Lost Avenue. And I've been to Gettysburg 100 times. I mean, I live close enough. If I want to go there, you know, on a whim, it's no big deal. It's, you know, 45-minute drive. I go there quite often. I'd never been there. And I'm looking up how to get to this place, and they said, you know, it's really difficult to get to. And you kind of walk this trail down to a creek and then take a hard left up onto this hill. It's unclear if you're trespassing when you park your car. It's unclear if you're trespassing down this trail, but then you're definitely on the battlefield when you get up on top of this hill. It looks like other parts magically, you know, it's just like a real rough trail. It's not maintained. Yeah. And all of a sudden you're on the top of this hill and it's maintained. It looks like the rest of the battlefield there. And we went, and I thought, well, I'm going to try to find where this guy's place was. They said he had a cabin. They said he had a hand-dug well beside it. He lived in a cave before he moved to the cabin. So we had a couple of things to look for. And we went there in February, my friend John and I'd taken some maps from the 1800s, and we overlaid, you know, them on Google satellite photos from today, and just trying to figure out where he was. We had a couple places with, well, it might be here, it might be there. We didn't know for sure. But we went and we looked around all day for hours and hours, just kind of wandering through the woods there and trying to figure out where he could have been. And we're getting ready to leave. And this is, you can hear this real time because I was recording it for my podcast. I actually said out loud, I was like, well, Hermit, if you got something to show us, now's the time, because we're going to leave. And I looked over to my right, and just off the side of the field, I could see this indentation in the ground. I said to John, I was like, does that look like, that looks like a foundation, doesn't it? And he said, it sure does. And we walked over there, and it's, you know, square, rectangular sort of foundation or just spot in the ground where you could tell something was. This is a really good candidate. It was a place on the hill. It wasn't at the top of the hill, so you still got some shield from the wind, and it wasn't so close to the creek where it would flood. It's a really good candidate. And I said, if only we could find the well, then we would know. And I swear to you, I looked over to my left, and I was like, look, there's a well. It's perfect hand-dug well. It's lined with stones. There's still water in it today. And we knew we had the right place. And it was so amazing to me. I was like, I don't know. It was like, I guess it was part of my quest of finding these folks and all that. But it felt magical. I was so excited about it. I told my other friend, Chad, and we went back the next week. Well, the next week, it's super cold. And Chad's like, well, are you sure it's his cabin? I'm like, it has to be his cabin. It's the remnants of the cabin. There's a hand-dug well there. He's like, well, it burnt down. So he had hanged himself in the cabin. And a few years afterwards, it burnt down. It was empty for a while. And he said, well, there should be carbon in the ground because that doesn't go away. We should be able to find evidence of it having been burnt down. So I took him there, and he dug down and immediately finds carbon. He's like, yep, there's carbon. This is it. It burnt down. This is the place. And he said, did you find his cave? I said, we looked all day, Chad. I don't know that we can find it. And he's like, well, let's look up here. And it was the one place John and I didn't look. And we go up, and there's these like kind of these boulders there. It's not really a cave. It's more like a stone chamber. Made by boulders that have kind of like shifted. I don't know if the glacier pulled them on top of each other or something. I don't know. But I walked around the backside. It just looked like a stone formation, of which in Gettysburg, there's millions of them. There's tons of them all around there. So it's not unusual to find these big boulders and stuff. But I happened to walk around the backside, and there it was, this opening, and crawled in. And the cracks of the cave, he had little stones stacked up to block the wind out where the boulders didn't quite match. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure this is it. And then I walked around the other side, and there's a chimney. You could still see the remnants of a chimney he had there. I'm like, this is it. This is where he was living. So we found his cave. It was really amazing. And I went to the Historical Society in Gettysburg and told them, and they just didn't care. They were just like,
really?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was like, I found this hermit, and they were just like, huh, interesting. But like that was.
Gettysburg, they're like, we got enough history here, dude. We don't want
If it's not Civil War,
yeah.
If it's not Civil War, they're kind of like, But to me, it was incredible. It was incredible, and I've not found a photo of him. I put a drawing in the book. My drawing of him is based on. There's one drawing in a newspaper, very poor drawing of him in the newspaper, and I sort of based my drawing on that drawing from the newspaper, but. He's one of there's a few in there that there aren't photos of, but I think there's like 4 maybe that there aren't photos of that I write about. Every other hermit in there, you can see a photo of him. But the Gettysburg, finding that was so exciting to me and so meaningful. And I was like, I can't not include that story in the book. And then that led me to the Hermit road trip with my son, where I went up to New England. We looked for William Woodruff's place. We ended up going to Irving Castle. We're trying to find one of the Leatherman caves, but I didn't want to force my son was just accompanying me. He's not a hermit head, so I didn't want to force him to spend every day looking for hermits. So we did too, and did some other things that that he wanted to do, and so forth. But I was happy with that. So I had to go back and find the Leatherman caves, some of which they said are pretty treacherous to get to.
I bet, yeah. I thought it was. We must be kindred spirits, because when I was reading the first chapter, and I may butcher you went to William Woodruff's grave. And when I was reading the first chapter, you don't mention going to the grave till the end of the book. Mm-hmm. But I think you do mention that he's buried somewhere or whatever in the first chapter. And I was like, and he had an obsession with these flowers. And I was like, someone should fucking, I'm like, when I read the chapter, and I'm like, if it isn't there already, I hope someone's planting those flowers at this dude's grave. And then at the end of the book, you go and fucking plant the flowers at this guy's grave. So I was like, God bless Timothy Renner, man. I had to do it. He planted hollyhocks. So hollyhocks were, so the story goes, and with William Woodruff, there's a lot of legend mixed in with truth, and I kind of love both. So in his chapter, it's kind of weave both together. His
his love, this Agatha Hinsdale, if she was a real person, I can find no one by that name. She was supposed to be the daughter of a lieutenant governor, and assuming they meant Connecticut, there was never a lieutenant governor with the last name of Hinsdale in Connecticut. So was that her married name? I have no clue. But supposedly she gave him a daguerreotype photo of herself, and he was in love with her. He was in his 40s, she was in her 20s, and he asked to marry her, and she turned him down. And that supposedly he goes off and becomes a hermit, takes a vow of silence. Now, was this vow of silence real, or was it a practical vow of silence, essentially put on, because of his solitude? I don't know, but there are newspaper stories of him handing out hollyhocks to people who passed his cabin. His cabin would have been on the road between Colebrook River, Connecticut, and Winsted, Connecticut. Not a heavily traveled road, but people would have passed by his cabin. And there's several stories for many different years in the newspaper of him handing out hollyhocks to people as they passed his cabin. Wouldn't say a word to them, but he'd give them these flowers. And the story was that was Agatha Hinsdale's favorite flower, these hollyhocks. What a wonderful thing, He goes on, has quite an interesting life. As far as I know, he kept that vow of silence, but for one time he did walk to Winstead and asked for apple pie.
Yeah.
So, which on my part is a worthy reason to break your vow of silence. But I would absolutely break my vow of silence for apple pie. But as far as I know, otherwise he pretty much kept to himself. And the photographer who took his photos did note that he tried to talk to him. He wouldn't say a word to him. So,
yeah.
Was that the vow of silence, or did he just not like talking to people? I don't know. But the story goes, and I think this is probably more legend than not, is that he lit his cabin on fire, and they found him, burning in the flames, holding this daguerreotype photo of Agatha Hinsdale. I think the other story is probably more likely true, that he was smoking his pipe in bed and sparks hit his clothes and his beard, and everything went up in flames. He walked 2 miles in bare feet to his closest neighbor's house. They got him to a doctor. I think he had probably horrible burns. His last 2 months of his life were probably pretty brutal. Very, very painful to die that way. And I think he probably hung on for 2 months and died of the burns, because it's 2 months after this fire he dies, and he's but very interesting stories. Interesting guy, and like I said, he was the first one. He kicked it all off. So as I was going up there, I have my friend John, the one who went with me to the Gettysburg Hermit. He's a farmer, and he had started, after I did the William Woodruff story on the podcast, he started growing hollyhocks. And I said, hey, I want to take a hollyhock up and plant it on his grave. And he had one for me. So here you go.
Yeah.
Gave it to me in a pot, and I'd planted it. I don't know if they're still there. But I planted it there. Who knows? Maybe it's got mowed over. Maybe somebody took it off. But last I saw, there was a hollyhock on William Woodruff's grave. So.
That's awesome. Well, I may end up, this is kind of around me, so I may end up swinging over to check it out sometime. Because, it's remarkable how, like the Hermit golf course and sort of the grave and everything, it's like the Gettysburg people, it's like these folks are kind of like, you're bringing new life to these people whose stories.
Yeah. In my introduction, I addressed that, and there's the idea, and my own brother, as I say in the introduction, calls people losers, and I hate that term. It's so dismissive. I would never use it. I've always disliked it. I don't like it at all, but I'm sure he would refer to these people as losers. And the thing is, all the people that were normal and everyday people that, just had normal jobs and did normal things, their stories are lost. We don't know anything about them. All the millions and millions of people that just did everything they're supposed to do and had a normal life. These fellas, they're not lost. I found their stories. If there's, if you believe in the idea of second death, you die once, and then again when everybody forgets you. Well, they're not lost. They're not forgotten. here I am, it's saving hermits from the second death.
There you go. Yeah, no, it's a wonderful sentiment in the introduction. It's actually here in my notes about, the losers versus the lost. And it's like, the people you think are marginalized, maybe even back then in that society, if people were like, oh, this is a marginalized person on the edge. And it's like, well, it turns out in 150 years, the only one people that gets remembered is the person who's marginalized on the edge, because the farmer who just lives a normal fucking life is lost to history.
Yeah. We know nothing about them. Millions of people, we don't know their names. We know nothing about, I mean, we can pick random people out of the census and then try to figure them out, but come on, it's good luck with that. But yeah, these guys are, they're not lost. I've found them in a sense, and enjoyed every second of it. Like it was, like I said, it was hard work doing this research, but I enjoy it. It's very enjoyable to do, and I just love finding these stories. I think they're absolutely fascinating. And
given what we know, sort of just about the history of, like I said, what I was saying earlier, like, oh, maybe the New England thing's an old world. I would imagine, I don't know if you've even scratched the surface of this, but I would imagine England and Europe is probably rife with similar characters who were hermits. I bet you that's insanely rich.
Yeah, and France too. It's I wish I could read French, because there was some great hermits in the Hermit Miscellany section, which is just a chapter filled with photos of folks I either couldn't find any information on, or only a little bit, or I just didn't have time to write about. At some point, I just had to, like 300 plus pages, I had to call it done. But there's some wonderful French hermits in there that I would love to write about, and I just can't find enough information. Google Translate can only give you so much.
Right. Yeah.
But and plenty through England and Scotland. Like, at some point, there could definitely be a volume 2. I just need a break for a while.
You need a break from the hermits. Yeah.
This was 3 years of my life that it was intense. It was intense getting this done and doing a podcast and trying, it's like juggling, trying to keep everything going.
Yeah, man. I don't know how you do it. And this, in a sense, I could see how you would find the time and energy to do this, because the stories are so fascinating. The people are so interesting. I feel like, because I was trying to get on with my everyday life between reading the book, and I just kept wanting to get back to the hermits.
Such a compliment. Thank you so much. Like,
it's like, I gotta eat dinner, but I want to get back to the fucking hermits after that.
Yeah. I and the question for me is, as an author, and I don't know if I'm an author first at this point, an illustrator second. I think they go hand in hand for me. Is how do I incorporate illustrations in this? And it ended up being, for me, this is my favorite illustrations. You would think Bigfoot would be more fun to illustrate. No, this was so much fun and such an interesting challenge to illustrate that I just had. I love designing books. I love illustrating, and I think on both fronts, I think these are my best illustrations in any book I've done so far. And I've got a handle on book design now that I'm really excited about going forward. But the illustrations are just, I poured my heart into them, and
they're tremendous.
Just super excited. And I think they incorporated well. I was afraid, like, are they going to compete with the photos or anything like that? But I think it went well. I'm very, very happy with the illustrations. So incredible journey for me, incredibly fun, but it was work. It was 3 years of, pretty intense work. I started a second podcast. I ended up just putting that on the, I can't do both. Like, I have to keep Strange Familiars going because it pays the bills, and I have to get this book done. So I had to shelve the second podcast for a while. But it was a joy.
Well, like I said, it's a masterpiece, dude. And it all comes together, like the drawings, the photos, the biographies. It really does all kind of come together in a really magical kind of way. And, setting aside William Pester's legal troubles, I'd say all of the hermits are kind of like endearing in a way. Like they're kind of like the underdog in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, as someone who came from whatever, the underground music, punk rock, all that, these guys they just speak to my heart, the guys and women. And this was my love letter to Hermits. It really was, to just like, man, like, just did what they wanted. It's like, you know what? I'm going to do what I want. And peace out, everybody. And more power to him, He's incredible.
Yeah, it really is amazing. I was thinking about this too, as sort of, reading the book where it's like, can someone even be a modern hermit? You kind of address this in a way about sort of the litigious nature of the world and shit. But I suppose like some of the hermits had their own property and shit. So it's interesting in a way. You could be a modern hermit and completely online. Like I work from home. I'm practically a fucking hermit now, dude. I barely, it's kind of, it's weird. The world's changed in a way where you could live in a cabin somewhere close enough where you can order fucking your groceries. You could, you don't have to live off the land. You can be online all day and not talk to anyone for years. And it's like, I guess you're a hermit.
Like researching this and writing this through the pandemic, it's like, it becomes like, it's kind of an option, and, I was talking with my wife on our podcast this week, and she was saying how like in some ways we're kind of fully formed as kids, and I was like, I was a monster kid. I love Bigfoot and all that. I said, I don't know how the hermit thing works, and she's like, are you kidding me? She's like, whenever you talk about being alone, like she's like, your favorite times as a kid, like you have these glowing talks about just being alone in the woods with your dog, just walking away from your family for a day and being in the woods. She's like, those are your favorite times. I'm like, oh, I guess you're right. I guess there is that aspect of it, but I think modern times it would be both easier and harder to be a hermit. I think, harder in terms of property, harder in terms of really separating yourself and really finding that isolation, but easier in a way that, if you wanted to have, do it, like you said, do an internet business or internet job. You got the ability right there.
Yeah. And it's interesting too. I think in modern times, people conflate hermit with homeless.
Right.
And they think someone's like, oh, this is a homeless person. It's like, actually, they have homes. They, they may not be what you think constitutes a home. Right. But, it's like we were talking about the guy in Maine or whatever that lived in a tent. That was his home. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if that makes him homeless, folks, because like he chose to live out in the forest, in the tent, in that. He adopted that lifestyle. It didn't seem like he had to take it on out of necessity.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of these guys, a lot of the cabins look very similar. Like if you look at these guys' cabins, one to the other looks very, very similar. They're very rustic, we'll say.
Yeah. Yeah.
But even my friend's cabin, it did not look unlike these fellas. Like when he was living in Massachusetts alone, it kind of looked like one of these places. So, but yeah, they have homes. They're just choosing to live, I guess they were the original tiny homes, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They just choose to like sort of exist on the fringe of society in a way. It's really, I felt a certain kinship with these folks. I really did. I was like, I can kind of, I could, if I was it back then, I probably would have been the town hermit. So, especially because part of me is like, well, I am kind of sometimes social, but then there's a guy in the book, he had 50,000 visitors, Mason A. Walton, to sign his guest book. So it's like, well, shit. You don't have to live like this pious, solitary lifestyle. Also, one of the guys I loved in the book was the world champion woman hater. Which is like the ultimate form of like reverse psychology, it seemed. Because like the more they publicized how much he hated women, it would be like, but there seem to be a lot of women that swing by his
I wonder if that wasn't a little hook on his part. He kind of knew what he was doing. And the women he did meet had nothing but nice things to say about him. So it was Albion Clough. He was from Maine. Yeah, he billed himself as the world champion woman hater, and would write all these songs about how much he hated women. He had a dummy that he made, like literally like a stuffed dummy that he sat outside he called his place the Ark of Maine. It was an old boat that he turned into a hermit hut. And he names him Bill, I think, the dummy. And they asked him why. He's like, well, women prefer dummies, so they'll leave me alone. had a stuffed snake he hung above the door of his place. He said, women were afraid of snakes. They had a big stuffed snake. Really quite a character. He was on some newsreels. I've not been able to find him. I would love to track him down because I would love to hear his voice. Yeah, because he was played and sang songs, and he went to New York. He was on some radio show. Ended up again meeting these women, these performers of the time, and they had nothing but glowing things to say about him. So you really wonder if it was just like a little hook he had. And it seemed like he would get a lot of fan mail from women. They're like, I'll change your mind. I'll make you like.
That was it. Yeah. It was real like, character. Oh, this guy, I know what you're doing here, man. Yeah. That's pretty clever. Yeah.
Very, very interesting character. And like just white hair, like long white hair, really like striking looking guy too. And play guitar and banjo. And I would have loved, if he was still around, I'd be going to Maine to visit him for sure. He just seemed like such a character.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's like, it just seems like this is like a completely from a different era in a way. Like you can't go and I don't know, maybe you can. Maybe there's something out there. Maybe someone will contact us or someone's told you. Like you can't, I don't know of anywhere you can go today to go see a fucking hermit.
Right. Yeah. Other than a religious hermit. Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yeah. You know what I mean?
But and think about it, like he turned his boat into a house. Well, you try to do that today, you're going to have inspectors showing up. You can't do this and you can't do that. You can't have this there for good and bad reasons. Right. But it's just, I think there's just so many reasons that they're of that time. It was just a little bit freer. Now, just less restrictions and then just less people in their business, quite honestly. You could slap up a house if you wanted to, and heat it with a stove and nobody's going to say anything. And nowadays, they're like, well, we need to inspect that before you live there. You can't have this and you can't have that. And, so I don't, could you take a boat and make it into a rough hermit house these days? I'm seriously doubting it, But
because they'd be like, that goes against residential regulations and shit. It's like, exactly. Oh, come on, dude. It's on my property. Why can't I just live on this boat that I fashioned into a house?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's a real, it's like a real throwback sort of character archetype from the olden days that we just don't really see anymore. Certainly not like you were saying before, like every town had a fucking hermit. Like that's just so unfathomable to me.
And I think part of it is we can't, like, just from all the just dumb, and again, some of them are good regulations and some of I understand that, but in general, just all these dumb bureaucracy and regulations, it just makes it so hard to just do that now.
Yeah, they legislated out the hermits, which is I do. Yeah, I also think like if someone is a hermit these days, like there's a compulsion to like pull them out of their existence. With like, they need help, even if they don't, and they're like, well, we're going to take you away from your hermitage, which is a new thing I learned from reading the book Hermitage. That was just where their living arrangements. Take you from your hermitage and put you in a mental institution or. Be taken in or fucking even taken to jail. And it's like, geez, just let the hermit be. Yeah.
Yeah. I think like several of these guys today would have just been taken off and like, yep, you're going into a home. Like, and they're perfectly fine. I mean, so one of my favorites was John Stink. He's this Osage Indian.
Yeah.
And there's an oil strike on Osage land. So he becomes a hermit. So his whole thing, and it's so interesting, is they called him a living ghost. And he supposedly died as many as 3 different times. And came back to life. And now, again, this is in newspapers written by white people. I'm not sure how much of this jives with Osage beliefs. I can only go by, what the article said. But supposedly his people were like, no, the dead are supposed to stay dead. Stay away from us, right? So he goes to live alone. for whatever reason. Maybe it's that reason, maybe others, but he's living alone. And then there's an oil strike on Osage land in the early 1900s, and they become per capita at that time, I think, the wealthiest people in the world due to this oil strike. So John Stink gets a portion of this money. He could have built a mansion to live in. Like, he was super wealthy.
Yeah.
He chose to live in a tent. He wanted to live outside. That's the way he wanted to live. He had his dogs. He wanted to live outside with his animals. You know, that's his choice, right? Like, that's what
exactly.
he wanted to do. And like, more power to him. You know, he seemed to be happy. At some point, there was a rabies outbreak. He was in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. There's a rabies outbreak. And in the paper, it says all dogs are required to be muzzled because of this rabies outbreak, except John Stink's dogs. They literally said that in the paper because everybody knew him so well and his dogs were so well trained and so, you know, good and stayed with him so much. They just said, but not John Stink's dogs. Every other dog has to have a muzzle. Well, some marshals in the town, they don't name him in the paper, but one day he just shoots all of John Stink's dogs, just kills them.
Yeah.
And you have to, like, people knew who he was. Like, I have to think this was done
maliciously.
Yeah, I have to believe that because everybody knew who John Stink was. Like I said, in the newspaper, they said the law doesn't apply to him. That's how well known he was, you know? So he says, I will never come to this town again. I'll never visit Pawhuska again. But for one time, I think I found one instance of him going back to town for supplies or something. I forget now what it was, but he visits one time. But other than that, he holds to that. He never returns to town. He stays outside of town, lives in a tent, eventually buys some of his own property. And some of the photos of him, he looks very imposing. He was a big guy, had a knife on his belt, cigar usually hanging out of his mouth. And he had barbed wire around his property. And a lot of the photos are him just standing at that fence where people just snapped a picture of him just standing at the barbed wire fence. But super nice guy. Donated tons of money to he donated tons of money to the American Legion Hut for the Osage. He put many Osage girls through private school. He paid for their tuition. Donated to every church in the area. He was Catholic, but he donated to all the churches. He gave, I think, $1,000 to every church. Now, this is $1,000 in 1920 or whatever. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah. Real money to every church in the area. So not a curmudgeon, it seems like, not a nasty guy, just somebody who wanted to live outside and live alone, you know?
Yeah.
And it sounds like a super nice guy, but just wanted to be alone.
Yeah. It's an awesome book. I mean, I think people have figured that out by now, just from my how much I love this book. It's really tremendous. People can get it on Amazon, or that's the best way to get it on Amazon, or you want people.
However, I don't care. Just get it. You can get it. If Amazon's easy, get it. I understand that they're, the big evil corporation, but they're also everywhere and it's easy.
Yeah.
You can get it directly from me. All my contact information is at strangefamiliars.com. You can get it directly from me. You can order it into your local bookstore. Several people have told me they've seen it at their local bookstore. That makes me extremely happy. I'm super happy that local bookstores would order this in. But whatever way, life's hard enough. Get it whatever ways you want, whatever way's easiest.
There you go. And I don't think I've ever recommended this before for a book, but I would say, folks, contact your fucking local library and have them get this book, because this is the kind of book, if I had kids, I would be like, or if I taught a class in school or some shit on history, I would be like, all right, bang, everybody pick a hermit and write a paper on this hermit, because that's how good this fucking book is. So
thank you. Thank you so much, man. Seriously, like, I poured my heart into it. And like I said, I think it's, my love letter to these people. So to hear you say that, it makes my heart swell in a good way. Thanks.
It's wonderful, man. It's wonderful. Now you're basking in the hermitness now and doing the hermit round. So, but what do you have next? What you cooking up anything, that people can look forward to in the future? Obviously, you got the Strange Familiars podcast. And as you said, strangefamiliars.com is where to find that.
Yeah. So Cutchin and I are batting around some ideas. There will be another Cutchin Renner project in the future, and not sure how soon that is. I have a couple books on Pennsylvania folklore I want to illustrate and get out there that I've been sort of, when I get too much hermit research for a while, I just kind of bop over and do some more research on some of the stuff. So some Pennsylvania folklore books I got coming out, and some more stuff on Bigfoot probably eventually. I love the big hairy guy, so I'll get back there. But right now, I'm very excited to have I think this is my first book that isn't like straight paranormal, right? Josh keeps telling me it's paranormal adjacent. I'm like, well, I guess, but I don't know. I
don't know how you would describe it. It's like history. It's
history, yeah.
It also like a subculture, like a sort of fringe subculture.
Yeah,
I don't know.
But it's not
paranormal adjacent.
It's certainly not a straight paranormal book, and it's my first one.
No.
Yeah, that's not that. So I'm super excited to see how it'll do. And then so lots of projects upcoming. So we'll see what happens first. Right now I'm in the stage where I'm like, well, what is going to be the thing I'm going to throw all my effort in to come out next? If Josh has his way, it'll probably be the thing we do together, but we'll see.
Of course. Well, on that note, Timothy,
Josh, by the way,
what's that?
I love writing with Josh. We complement each other well. I think we drive each other up the wall just enough to push each other to do better.
That's great. And your book, like I said, we got to do a Where the Footprints End show down the line, because
happy to do it.
It's such a. I've actually like brought up the whole idea like on multiple shows, with Bigfoot guests and stuff. So it's like we've never actually done a dedicated BOA exploration of that whole thing. So we definitely will. But our time tonight has ended, and I want to thank you so much, Timothy. This has been an absolute blast. I mean, I love the book, and I can't put it over enough. I have never minded the loneliness. Folks, get it. You're going to love it. You're going to absolutely love it. And this is definitely not the last time we chat here on the show, because, like I said, we got to do the thing with Kutch, and I want to do a Strange Familiar sort of exploration. 500 shows. I mean, there's a lot to dig into there, and we haven't even. We only did whatever the Hermit ones you did tonight. Yeah. So there's lots and lots and lots to talk about. So thank you so much, man. It's been an absolute blast. And I look forward to talking again in the future.
All right. Thanks for having me.